The ship moved through the dark the way old men move through rooms. They built themselves slow, certain, and not expecting anything to have changed. Ambassador Velserith stood at the forward observation deck with his hands folded behind his back and watched the dead star system grow in the glass. Sol, the humans had called it. A yellow dwarf. Unremarkable. The kind of star that hatched life the way dirty water hatches mosquitoes carelessly, without intention, and usually to everyone's regret. He had requested this assignment himself. That was the part none of his staff understood. Why would a man of his standing 300 years in conclave diplomatic service, negotiator of the Theron Accords, the only living diplomat to have spoken directly with a chorus-adjacent entity and survived the conversation, why would such a man ask to survey a confirmed dead world? Because Velserith had been on the council that voted for the quarantine 206 years ago. He had been young then, relatively speaking, a junior attaché. He had not cast the deciding vote. He had not drafted the order, but he had raised no objection when the measure passed, and in 300 years of diplomacy he had learned that silence in a room where decisions are made is its own kind of signature. He owed this, he thought. A final confirmation. A clean record. The third planet came into view. He looked at it the way you look at a scar you forgot you had, with a distant kind of recognition, and nothing else. Sol 3. Earth. Confirmed uninhabited. The report was 2 centuries old but had been re-verified by long-range scans 17 times since. Radiation index. Consistent with sustained orbital strike patterns. Atmospheric particulate suggesting ongoing geological instability from impact craters. Surface temperature variations. Extreme enough to preclude complex biology. At the macro level. Dead. Clearly, definitively, mercifully dead. Begin the standard survey sweep, Velserith said. His aide, a young hegemony-born woman named Sael, tapped the sequence into her panel. Sweep initiated, Ambassador. Estimated surface pattern completion in 40 minutes. Do you want the confirmation drafted ahead of the findings? He considered. Draft it. Leave the specifics blank. She nodded. This was normal. Most survey confirmations for dead worlds were drafted before the sweep finished. The sweep was a formality. The findings were always what the previous 17 scans had said they were. The ship hummed. The sweep ran. Velserith walked to the small side table where his morning tea had gone cold and drank it anyway. He had spent 3 centuries drinking cold tea at exactly this kind of moment. There was something almost comfortable about it. Ambassador. Sael's voice was not alarmed. It was the voice of someone who had found something unexpected in a drawer they thought they knew, and was not yet sure whether it was interesting or dangerous. He turned. She was staring at her panel. The sweep is returning anomalous subsurface readings. Geological instability is expected. Noted in the... Not geological, sir. She looked up. Thermal. Structural. Organized thermal signatures at approximately 240 meters below surface grade. She paused. Across 17 mapped locations simultaneously. Velserith set down his cold tea. He walked to her panel. He looked at the data. He looked at it again. He pulled up the previous scan reports, all 17 of them, and ran a comparison. The previous scans had not gone subsurface. They had read the surface. The surface was dead. No one had thought to look below it. No one had thought to look below it because dead things do not dig. Adjust the sweep parameters, he said. His voice was professional. It was very good at being professional. Full subsurface penetration. All depths. She adjusted. The sweep ran again. The data came back in sections. First the 200-meter depth, then the 3 to 100, then the 4 to 100. The signatures built like a sentence that keeps adding words after you think it's finished. Thermal clusters becoming power grids, becoming water systems, becoming transit lines, becoming, at the 600-meter depth, something that the ship's analysis system flagged with a symbol. Velserith had never seen it use. He leaned in. The symbol meant, population density exceeds scan parameter maximum, unable to complete count. He straightened up. Sael said nothing. She was the kind of young person who understood when silence was the right response. Take us into orbit, Velserith said. She opened her mouth. Take us into orbit, he said again. Same tone. Different weight. She did. The ship descended through Sol's outer system into tight orbit around the third planet, and the full picture assembled itself on every screen on the bridge at once, like a puzzle that had been waiting for someone to dump out the pieces. 17 surface locations, 11 additional locations the preliminary sweep had missed. Underground architecture spanning 6 of the planet's 8 continental landmasses, power output readings that would have ranked this civilization as a mid-tier conclave member state if those readings had been visible from outside. They had not been visible. They had been, it was now apparent, deliberately shielded. 200 years, Velsereth said quietly. No one answered him. The bridge crew was watching their screens with the careful stillness of people who understood that what they were witnessing was above their pay grade and below their clearance level. He did not need an answer. He was talking to the data. 200 years underground, 200 years of shielded output and buried architecture and 0 surface signal, and 17 consecutive long-range scans reading exactly nothing. That took precision. That took patience. That took the kind of organizational control that most surviving civilizations couldn't maintain for a generation, let alone 200 years. And it had worked. Perfectly. Until 30 minutes ago. He was still thinking about this when the ground opened. There was no other way to describe it. The surface of the planet, the scarred, radiated, geologically battered surface of what was supposed to be a dead world, cracked along lines that were obviously not geological. Seams. Enormous seams, running for kilometers in deliberate straight lines. The hatches because they were hatches. This was obvious now. No point pretending otherwise slid back. Hydraulic. Measured. Precisely controlled. Velsereth counted 11 of them opening simultaneously. Light came up from below, not the yellow-orange glow of geothermal activity. White light. Blue-white. Artificial light. The color of a civilization that had decided what kind of light it wanted, and built machines to make exactly that. Then the heat signatures started rising. People. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. Coming up from below in organized movement, not a scramble, not a crowd, but structured, patterned movement that spoke of drills and plans and people who had been told exactly what to do when this moment came. And they had prepared for this moment. That was clear. They had been waiting for exactly this. Ambassador, Sale said. Her voice had moved from careful professional neutrality into somewhere between impressed and scared. They're signaling us. I know. In hegemony standard. He looked at her. Perfect hegemony standard, or approximated? She listened to the signal for a moment. Perfect, sir. No accent. No errors. Current idiom. She paused. Not the standard from 200 years ago. Current standard. The same dialect we're using right now. He thought about what that meant. Thought about how a civilization buried underground for 200 years would have kept its language current. The only answer was that they had been listening. All that time, silently, below the surface of a world the conclave thought was empty. They had been listening to conclave communications and updating their language accordingly. They've been monitoring us, he said. Yes, sir. For how long? Based on the idiom accuracy? She hesitated. All of it, sir. I think all of it. 200 years of listening. Not just surviving. Listening, recording, learning, keeping pace with a galaxy that had written them off. From the inside of a planet that galaxy thought was a tomb. He had spent 30 years of his career in rooms where civilizations negotiated the terms of their survival. He had seen desperate peoples and proud peoples and broken peoples and peoples who had become something frightening in the process of being cornered. He had never seen anything quite like the shape of what was rising from the ground below him. Request landing clearance, he said. His aide turned sharply. He could feel her concern without looking at it. We came to confirm their status. We will confirm it properly. Ambassador, the security protocols for first, they already know our protocols, Sael. He picked up his cold tea again. Put it back down. Request landing clearance. They landed in the mouth of the largest open hatch, a space so vast that the diplomatic shuttle sat in it, the way a pebble sits in a cathedral doorway. The air that came in when the shuttle doors opened smelled like recycled atmosphere, mineral, clean in the specific way that only engineered air systems produce. And underneath that, something else, something organic. The faint green smell of growing things. Underground. They were growing things underground. Velsereth descended the landing ramp in full diplomatic dress, pale robes, the conclave's 12-ray seal on his collar, the silver conductor staff that served as both tool and symbol of his office. He had dressed carefully. He always dressed carefully. It projected stability, authority, the long, unbroken continuity of the institution he represented. The humans watching him from the perimeter said nothing about his clothes. There were perhaps 200 of them at the landing zone. No weapons visible. That was either extremely good sign or extremely bad sign, and Velserith had enough experience to know that in this context it was almost certainly the latter. People who showed no weapons when meeting an unexpected alien vessel were not unarmed. They were simply people whose weapons were already aimed and therefore didn't need to be displayed. The humans looked like the archival images he had studied before departure: bipedal, bilaterally symmetrical, ranges of skin tone from very dark to very pale, the particular body variation that came from a species that had spread across a diverse planetary surface over tens of thousands of years. They wore clothes that were practical, dark, layered, functional, and they stood in organized groups that were obviously military formations wearing civilian clothes as a courtesy. Everyone was watching him. Every single person in that hangar, and none of them looked surprised. They had expected this. They had prepared for this. They had chosen this moment to open the hatches because they had decided they were ready, and not for a single second before. He walked forward. His aide and 2 security personnel followed. His security personnel were calm professionals who were very obviously doing rapid threat assessment and finding the math extremely uncomfortable. He stopped at the edge of the perimeter. A human stepped forward to meet him. Older, dark skin, close-cut silver hair, a face that had the kind of permanent stillness that came not from peace, but from extraordinary practice. She wore something on a cord at her throat that Velserith couldn't immediately identify. She did not offer a greeting gesture. She stood and waited for him to speak first. This, too, was deliberate. "I am Ambassador Velserith of the Galactic Conclave's Hegemony Diplomatic Service," he said, in careful hegemony standard. "I am here on a standard survey." He stopped. Because the word times, survey times, was, in this context, grotesque, and he was too good a diplomat to finish a sentence that had already failed. The woman watched him stop. She did not help him. She simply watched. "I am here," he said, and started over. "To confirm the status of the Sol system and its inhabitants." He paused. "I was not expecting inhabitants." "We know," she said. 2 words. Her standard was flawless. No warmth. No ice. Just information. He did not know how to respond to that. He was still searching for the correct response when there was a small movement at the edge of his vision. And he looked down. A child. A girl, perhaps 8 years old, who had apparently slipped through the perimeter of adults with the boneless ease that small children use to get places they are not supposed to be. She was standing 3 meters from him, head tilted, looking at him with the focused and slightly unsettling curiosity of a person who has heard a great deal about a thing and is now finally seeing it. She looked at his robes, his staff, his seal. She looked at his face. She said, in perfect hegemony standard, in a voice that was entirely matter-of-fact and contained not a single gram of hostility or fear, "Are you here to apologize?" The hangar was very quiet. Velserith had spoken to a chorus-adjacent entity and survived the conversation. He had sat across tables from warlords and tyrants and dying kings making their last bad deals. He had delivered and received the worst news that diplomatic service required a person to deliver and receive. He did not have an answer for a child of 8 years who asked him that question in a voice that suggested it was simply the most obvious and reasonable thing to ask. He looked at the woman with the silver cord. She was watching him. Her expression had not changed at all. The child was still waiting. Velserith opened his mouth. Closed it. 300 years of diplomatic training reached for something any of the 100 standard non-answer answers, the graceful deferrals, the redirections, and found nothing. Nothing that was not. In the face of this question, in this hangar, in front of these people who had spent 200 years underground, preparing for exactly this moment, nothing that was not simply insulting. "That is something," he said at last carefully, "that would need to be discussed at a higher level." The girl looked at him for a moment more. Then she nodded, as though this was more or less what she had expected. She turned and disappeared back into the crowd of adults who had, every one of them, watched the exchange without expression. The woman with the silver cord said, "My name is Commander Yara Ose, Terran Continuance Authority." She said it the way people say things they have said 10,000 times in their heads and are finally saying out loud. You'll want to see the city. She did not wait for his agreement. She turned and walked. He followed. Because there was nothing else to do. Because the situation had moved entirely outside any framework he had prepared for. Because the child's question was still sitting in the air between his ribs, clean and exact, and without a single easy exit. Because behind Commander Osei, as the corridor opened up, as the full scale of what humanity had built below the surface of its supposed tomb began to reveal itself in sections the height of the ceilings, the organized hum of systems beyond counting, the parks, the actual parks, with light so precise that the plants growing in them did not know they were underground. He began to understand something. They had not survived. Surviving was what animals did when they were hurt. They found a hole. They stayed in it. They tried to outlast the thing that hurt them. Surviving was desperate. Survival smelled like fear and compromise. This did not smell like that. This smelled like something that had decided, a long time ago, exactly what it was going to be. He walked through the first kilometer of Undercity Accra and counted 17 categories of infrastructure he did not recognize. Not primitive, not improvised, unrecognized. Technology developed outside any conclave knowledge base, built from the inside of a sealed system by a people who had no one to trade with and no one to ask, and no reason to do anything except solve the problem themselves. 200 years of solving problems alone. He thought about what that produced. He thought about 200 years of silence and grief and fury. All of it turned inward. All of it composted into something that grew in the dark. He thought about the child's question. He walked. The city went on for a very long time. Velserith had visited 41 inhabited worlds in his career. He had walked the grand boulevards of civilizations 10 times older than his own. He was not a man who was easily impressed by the works of others. But there was something in the precise control of this place, the absence of waste, the absence of excess. Everything built for a purpose and only for a purpose. And yet the presence of those underground parks, those absurd, defiant, completely unnecessary underground parks, with their perfect light, that settled somewhere in him and would not move. They had built beauty here. In the dark. After everything, that was not survival. That was a message. He was still trying to read it when Commander Osei stopped in front of a large display screen that had, with a kind of timing that was definitely not accidental, been left showing a manifest he was clearly not supposed to see. A fleet manifest. Ship classes. Numbers. Deployment status. He had 3 seconds before Osei reached out and closed the screen. 3 seconds was enough. He was very good at reading fast. He did not say anything about it. She did not say anything about it. They walked on, and Velserith, for the first time in 300 years of diplomatic service, did not know what the next move was, did not know what these people wanted, or how they wanted it, or what they had become in the dark. He only knew one thing for certain. They were not what the Conclave thought they were. They had never been what the Conclave thought they were, and the Conclave had just walked into the middle of a plan that had been running for 200 years without knowing it. He touched the Conclave's 12-ray seal on his collar. It felt, suddenly, like a very small thing. Commander Yara Osei had given this tour exactly once before. That time it had been for the Terran Council, 12 people in a room, who needed to understand what they were authorizing before they authorized it. She had walked them through the same corridors, shown them the same systems, let the scale of the thing speak for itself. It had taken 4 hours. 3 of the 12 had cried. None of them had been embarrassed about it. This was different. These were not her people. These were the people who had looked at her world from the safety of deep space, decided it was over, and flown home to dinner. She walked ahead of the Conclave delegation at a pace that was helpful without being rushed, not too fast. She wanted them to see everything. That was the entire point of this. She wanted them to see all of it, every kilometer of it, every system, and every corridor, and every underground park, with its perfect blue-white light. Because seeing it was the only way to understand what the seeing cost. The delegation moved behind her in a cluster. 7 of them, plus the ambassador. Velserith walked nearest to her, 3 steps back, with the careful, controlled posture of a man who was very good at not showing what he was thinking. The others were less skilled. She could hear them talking to each other in low voices, could hear the specific pitch of voices that are trying to sound calm and failing at it. Good. The first section of Undercity Accra was the transit hub. Magnetic rail lines running on 4 levels. moving people between residential sectors and work sectors and the agricultural belt in the eastern deep. The trains were not loud. They had spent 40 years making them not loud, because underground noise accumulates and becomes a weight that people carry in their shoulders in their sleep. The trains moved like dark water, fast and smooth, and nearly silent. There were thousands of people in the transit hub at this hour. Morning shift beginning, night shift ending, people with bags and children, and the small armor of routine that people everywhere build around themselves when they are just trying to get through the day. They looked at the delegation. The delegation looked at them. Nobody said anything, but the quality of the silence said everything. The people of Undercity Accra had known this day was coming. Not this exact day, not the date, not the hour, but the shape of it, the outline. A day when the people from above finally came down, or the people from below finally went up, and the two things that had been running in parallel for 200 years finally occupied the same physical space. They had been told to be calm. They were calm, but there is a kind of calm that is not peaceful, a calm that is held deliberately. The way you hold something heavy above your head while you wait for the right moment to put it down. Yara kept walking. She took them through the fabrication district next. Long halls full of manufacturing equipment that hummed in frequencies the human body felt more than heard. Equipment that built other equipment. Component production, materials processing. Assembly lines for things that Velserith had already noticed, and she could tell he was trying to catalog and failing. He asked her, politely, what a particular array of machines produced. She told him. She watched him process the answer. She watched him understand that the item being produced was a significant piece of technology. She watched him ask, also politely, where the design schematics had come from. We improved them, she said. From what original design? Yours. She kept walking. Didn't look back. Didn't explain. The information sat behind them in the corridor, and he could do whatever he wanted with it, because that was the truth of it. Plain and undecorated. Everything the Conclave had fielded against Earth in the contact war, every weapon, every drive system, every defensive architecture, the pieces that survived the bombardment, the ones that fell incomplete and broken on a dying surface, humanity had collected, had carried underground, had spent 200 years taking apart, understanding, improving. They had started from the wreckage of what had been done to them, and they had built forward from there without stopping. The Conclave had given them the curriculum. Humanity had done the homework. She brought them to the agricultural belt at the 400-meter depth, because she wanted them to see it and because she knew what it would do to them. It was vast. 2. The scale of it was the first thing the ceiling vaulted 40 meters above. Beds of crops that stretched for kilometers under light arrays, so precisely calibrated that the plants grew in perfect vertical lines reaching toward illumination they could not tell from sunlight. Rice, wheat, vegetables in quantities that meant no one in Undercity Accra had ever been hungry, not in the entire 200 years of this place's existence. The air here smelled like growing things, like green and water and soil. Underground, 400 meters below a radiated surface, smelling like a field in summer. One of the Conclave delegation, a young one, a technical attaché with wide eyes who had not yet learned to keep his reactions internal, stopped walking and just stood in the entrance of the agricultural belt, with his mouth slightly open. Yara stopped and waited. She gave him the moment. She was generous with these moments because they cost her nothing and built toward something she needed. How long? The young attaché said. Has this been here? The first agricultural level was completed 83 years after the quarantine, she said. Before that, we were on processed rations. She paused. After that, we were not. He looked at the crops. He looked at the light. He looked at the sheer organized scale of a people who had decided that living in the dark was going to mean actually living, not just surviving. This is, he started. It's enough, she said, not unkindly. Come. She had a plan for this tour. Not a script, she didn't need a script, but a sequence. A deliberate order to the things she showed them, arranged so that each section landed against the previous one, the way a series of notes lands against each other when someone who knows music arranges them. Not random, not chaotic. A composition. The sequence was scale, then technology, then agriculture, then the schools. The schools were important. She always knew she would end with the schools. They walked through a residential sector on the way streets. Real streets, underground, with the kind of detail that only happens when people commit to permanence. Storefronts, community spaces, art on the walls, which was the detail she always watched the delegation's faces for, because that was usually where the understanding shifted. Not propaganda, not survival art, art for its own sake, murals and sculptures, and, in one corridor, a massive mosaic covering the full ceiling of a 40-meter-long passage depicting the surface of the earth, the one they couldn't live on, the one above their heads, blue sky, clouds, trees, a sun they could not see from here. It was extraordinarily beautiful, and it was the saddest thing Yara had ever looked at, and she had looked at it so many times that she had trained herself not to feel it anymore. She was feeling it now. She kept walking. The schools were in the eastern residential sector, a cluster of connected buildings organized around a central open space that served as a gathering area and a place for children to run, which children needed even underground, even when running was something you did in circles under artificial light. The buildings were well made, clean. Someone had planted flowers in boxes along the exterior walls, small, bright things that had no business being beautiful 400 meters underground, and were beautiful anyway. Classes were in session. Through windows you could see children at long tables, working. Their voices came through the walls as a general warm hum that didn't resolve into individual words, just the sound of a lot of minds engaged at once. Belserith was watching the school buildings with an expression that he was controlling very carefully. She had been watching him control his expressions for 2 hours now. He was very good at it, but he had been doing it for 2 straight hours, and control like that develops hairline cracks if you apply enough pressure. What do they learn? He asked. Everything, she said. Specifically, she looked at him. Science, history, engineering, mathematics, medicine, languages. She paused. Hegemony standard is mandatory from age 5. So is a working knowledge of conclave law and diplomatic protocol. She watched this land. We wanted to make sure, when this day came, that our people could speak to you directly. No intermediaries, no translators, no room for anything to get lost. He was quiet for a moment. You have been preparing for this specific day. For 200 years, she said. Yes. He nodded slowly. Not in agreement. In understanding. The way you nod when you finally understand the shape of something that has been in front of you the whole time. One of the other delegates, a heavy-set senior official from the Tura collective, whose name she had already noted and filed, said, with the well-meaning clumsiness of someone who thinks they are being generous, "It is remarkable. Given the circumstances, we had assumed you would not persist. The odds were..." Yara stopped walking. The delegation stopped behind her. She turned around. She did not move quickly. She was not rushed about it. She simply stopped, turned, and looked at the official with the full specific weight of her attention. She said 4 words. We know what you assumed. Then she turned back around and kept walking. Nobody said anything for a long time after that. The delegation followed in silence through 3 more corridors and a second transit junction, and the entrance to the deep infrastructure level where the power systems ran, and nobody said a single unnecessary word. Good, Yara thought. Let it sit. She was not angry. That was the thing that people always misread in her. They saw the stillness and read it as anger held back. And that wasn't it. Anger was something she had used up, carefully, over the years, in the right places. What she had left was colder and more useful. What she had left was clarity. She knew exactly what the conclave had assumed. She knew it because her grandmother had told her, in the years before the radiation finished what the bombs had started. Her grandmother had been on the surface, had seen the conclave ships in the sky on the day they left, had watched them go and understood, in the specific way that people understand things that they have no framework for and no words for, and no choice but to absorb, that no one was coming back. Her grandmother had spent the next 11 years on the surface, in the ruins, doing 2 things: finding children who had survived, teaching them everything she knew. At the end of 11 years, when the radiation had done enough damage that the rest was only a matter of time, she had called Yara's mother to her and said, "Remember what we're doing this for. Not revenge, not victory. Just this, that no one gets to decide what we are. Not ever again." She had given Yara's mother the tooth from her own mouth. A molar said, "Keep this. Give it to your daughter." Let her decide what it means when she's old enough. Yara had decided at 17. She had worn it since. She touched it now through the fabric of her collar, not thinking about it. The way you touch a thing you always touch without noticing anymore. She brought the delegation to the command level last. The command level was not a dramatic space. It was not designed to impress. It was a functional room, full of people doing their jobs, with the quiet competence of people who have been doing those jobs for a long time. Screens covering every wall, tracking systems, communications arrays, the full operational picture of a civilization running smoothly in the dark. And on one screen, a large screen on the eastern wall, a fleet manifest, pulled up for routine morning review, was clearly and accidentally visible. She watched Velserith see it. She watched his eyes move across it. She counted 3 seconds she had practiced this, and then she reached out and closed it. She said, "Apologies. That should have been closed before your arrival," he said. Of course. Neither of them believed the other, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so. What he had seen in those 3 seconds. 216 ships of classifications. The Conclave had no records for. Drive signatures his analysis team would spend the next week failing to match to anything in the Conclave database. Crew counts that put the total Terran military deployment at numbers that would have ranked them in the top tier of Conclave member state forces before the Void Chorus had eaten 4 of those member states, down to nothing. What she had let him see it for. So that when the time came, and it was coming, and everyone in this room knew it was coming, there would be no misunderstanding about what they were negotiating with. She walked the delegation back to the landing bay. The tour had taken 3 hours and 40 minutes. She had planned for 4. She was 12% more efficient than planned. Her team would note this. She didn't care. At the landing bay, Velserith stopped before boarding his shuttle and turned to face her. He had the look of a man assembling words very carefully, the way you assemble something fragile. "Commander Osei," he said. "What is it that your people want?" She looked at him. He was 300 years old and carried the weight of everything he had not done 200 years ago in the set of his shoulders, which she recognized because she carried similar weight in different places. She was not interested in his guilt. Guilt was between him and his own knights. What she was interested in was what came next. "What we want," she said, "is not something you can give us today." She looked past him at the shuttle, at the conclave seal on its side, at the 12-ray symbol that had been in the sky above her grandmother's head on the day those ships left. "But there are things you can give us eventually. We'll discuss them when there's something worth discussing." He waited. He seemed to sense there was more. There was. "You asked what we want," she said. "Here is what I will tell you for free, Ambassador. We do not want membership. We do not want partnership. We do not want to join the structure that left us here." She said it without heat, without theater. Clean information, edge to edge. "We want recognition of what happened, full, unambiguous, on the record. And we want the space to be what we've become, without anyone from above deciding what that is." She paused. "The rest is negotiable." "But not those 2 things." He nodded. The nod of a man who had expected something like this and found it still difficult to absorb now that it had been said. "I will convey your position," he said. "I know you will." She stepped back. "Safe travel, Ambassador." She watched the shuttle close, watched it lift, watched it pass through the ceiling hatch and disappear into the sky above. The same sky her grandmother had watched ships disappear into a long time ago, going the other direction. She stood in the empty landing bay for a moment. Then she touched the tooth at her throat. Then she went back to work. There was a council meeting in 2 hours. The Defense Committee was presenting updated deployment projections. The Agricultural Board had submitted a request for expanded grow light arrays in Sector 7. 17 different administrative systems needed her review by end of day. A civilization in the middle of changing the shape of its future still needed its paperwork done. She walked. The doors of the landing bay closed behind her. The city hummed around her. All of it, the trains, the fabricators, the schools, the parks, the power systems running deep below her feet, all of it going on, the way it always went on, patient, purposeful, the most ordinary, extraordinary thing in the known galaxy. A people who had been told they were finished, who had responded by building something this. She had a council meeting in 2 hours. She did not waste time feeling anything about what had just happened. She saved that for nights. when the lights in her quarters went to their lowest setting and the hum of the city was the only sound. And she lay awake the way she always lay awake, and she thought about her grandmother's hands and the soil of a surface she had never been allowed to touch. Not yet, not yet, but soon. The first world went quiet on a Tuesday. That was the thing nobody in the conclave talked about afterward that had happened on an ordinary day, in the middle of ordinary things. The Theron cluster's primary inhabited world, Saith, had been mid-broadcast when the signal cut. Not during a crisis, not during some grand moment that history could point to later and say, "Here. This is where it started." The last transmission from Saith was a weather report for the northern agricultural territories, calling for mild winds and a chance of rain. Then nothing. Terran deep-range monitoring stations, the small ones, built low and dark and patient, scattered across the outer system like seeds nobody had planted on purpose, caught the silence 11 minutes before the conclave's own network registered the loss. 11 minutes was a long time. Terran analysts used those 11 minutes well. By the time the conclave's emergency channels started lighting up, Undercity Accra's intelligence division already had 47 data points on what had happened to Saith. By the time the conclave convened an emergency session, that number was 212. Commander Yara Ose read the first report at 0340 hours in her quarters. In the dark, the way she read everything that came in during sleep hours, flat on her back, screen above her face, the tooth on its cord resting against her collarbone. She read it twice. Then she got up, dressed, and went to the operations center, because sleep was finished for tonight, and probably for several nights after this one. The operations center was already full when she arrived. People had come in without being called, which told her everything she needed to know about how the room was reading the situation. When trained professionals show up to work before they are summoned, it means the situation has a shape that everyone can already see, and the shape is not good. She took her position at the central table. The screens around the room were showing the conclave's emergency feeds alongside Terran's own monitoring data. Saith was gone, not destroyed in any way. The sensors could easily interpret not bombed, not burned, not cracked open, simply gone. The planet was still there. The infrastructure was still there. The void chorus did not waste energy on rubble. It ate the complexity out of things and left the shells. 2 days later, the second world in the Theron cluster went the same way. Then a third, the Conclave's joint military response, 12 warships from 4 member state fleets, assembled in 48 hours, which was genuinely fast by Conclave standards, entered the Theron system on day 4. They lasted until day 6. Yara watched the engagement feeds with the specific attentiveness of someone who is not watching for the outcome but for the mechanics. The Conclave fleet fought the way the Conclave fleet always fought, by the book, by the doctrine, by the careful, measured protocols of an institution that had not fought a real war in 2 centuries of enforced peace. Calculated engagement, asset preservation, the tactical withdrawal trigger set at 30% losses to prevent unacceptable attrition. At 29% losses, the fleet commander ordered withdrawal. The Void Chorus did not acknowledge the withdrawal. It did not pursue. It simply continued doing what it was doing, the way a tide continues doing what a tide does, regardless of whether the things on the beach are running or not. The fourth world in the Theron cluster went quiet on day 9. In the Terran Council chamber, a room that had been built large enough for exactly this kind of conversation, and had been waiting for it for a very long time, the argument began before the council was formally seated. There were 22 members of the Terran Senior Council. They were not all soldiers. They were not all hawks. They were engineers and doctors and agricultural directors and historians, and 3 people whose primary qualification was that they were extraordinarily good at thinking clearly, when everyone around them was not. The argument that wanted to let the conclave burn was made by 7 of them. Yara let them speak. Every word. Counselor Ades, not the general, the historian, an older woman who had spent 60 years documenting what the contact war had cost in generational terms, laid out the case, with the cold precision of someone who had spent decades organizing evidence. The conclave had quarantined them. The conclave had left them to die. The conclave had filed 17 consecutive survey reports confirming their extinction, and done nothing. No aid mission, no check, no single vessel sent to determine whether any human being was still breathing. And now the conclave needed them. Let me be direct, the historian said. They need us because they cannot handle this themselves. We can. We have been able to for some time. The question is not capability. The question is whether we owe them anything. And my answer is that we do not. 6 other voices agreed with her. Yara let the agreement sit in the room. Then General Addes, different person, same name, which caused constant administrative confusion that both women found privately funny, stood up. The general was 72 years old and built like a question that already knew its answer. She had commanded the Terran Defense Forces for 18 years. She had never fired a weapon in anger because there had been no one to fire at. She had spent 18 years preparing for a moment that she privately thought might never come, and she had prepared as though it definitely would. She said, "We didn't build all this to become them." The room went quiet. 7 words. She did not add to them, did not explain them, or support them with data, or reach for a follow-up argument. She said the 7 words, stood for a moment in the silence they made, and sat back down. The debate continued for 4 more hours. It was a real debate. Serious people on both sides, real arguments, real weight on both ends of the scale. Nobody who spoke was stupid. Nobody who spoke was wrong in the small sense. The arguments for doing nothing were not made from cowardice or laziness. They were made from 200 years of knowledge about what it cost to be abandoned, and the completely understandable human conclusion that a species that had done that once could not be trusted not to do it again. At the end of 4 hours, the vote was taken. 14-8. Not unanimous. 14-8. With 8 people in that room who would carry their dissent quietly and continue doing their jobs with full commitment, because that was the kind of people the Terran Continuance Authority had spent 200 years selecting and building and trusting. Yara looked at the result, looked at the 8, nodded once at the historian Addes across the table. The historian nodded back. Her face said, "I think you're wrong." Her face also said, "I will not be the reason it fails." That was enough. Yara left the council chamber and walked to her private communications room, which was a small space off the main corridor with enough shielding that a signal sent from it did not appear on the general monitoring grid. She sat down at the single console. She pulled up a frequency that she had kept stored for 3 weeks, since the day the Conclave's diplomatic shuttle had lifted out of the landing bay. She opened the channel. Velserith answered in 40 seconds. He was clearly not sleeping. He had not been sleeping, she suspected, since Saith went quiet. He looked at her through the screen with the face of a man who has been waiting for a call without letting himself believe the call would come. "Commander Osei," he said. "Ambassador," she said. "We'll help." The relief that moved across his face was brief and immediately controlled, but she saw it. 300 years of diplomatic training, and grief and guilt, compressed into one unguarded half-second. She filed it away without comment. "The conclave will be. There are conditions," she said. He stopped. Waited. Formal recognition of the contact war as an unprovoked act of aggression against a pre-contact civilization. On the record. Unanimous conclave vote. Public. She watched him absorb this. Full Sol system sovereignty. No conclave jurisdiction. No observation rights. No survey access without explicit Terran authorization. She paused. And one more thing. He waited. She told him the 3rd condition. He sat back in his chair. She waited while he processed it. She was patient. She had been raised by patient people in a city built by patient people underground. A dying world. And patience was not something she had to practice. It was something she simply was. "That will require," he said carefully, "an extraordinary session of the full conclave assembly. I know. The vote would not be certain. I know that too." She looked at him. "You have 6 days, Ambassador. The Void Chorus is moving at a rate that puts the next conclave-inhabited system in its path in 8. I am giving you 6, because I need 2 to move the fleet into position." She said it the way she said everything, clean, edge to edge, no decoration. "Use the 6 well." He nodded. Then he stopped nodding. Something had shifted in his expression. The diplomat was still there, but something had pushed through underneath it. The man who had been on the council 200 years ago. The one who had not objected. The one who had drunk his cold tea and signed his name and moved on. "You said the fleet," he said. "You said you need 2 days to move it into position." He paused. "Where is it now?" "In position for a different deployment scenario," she said. "How many ships?" She had decided in advance that she would tell him this, not because she had to, because she wanted him to understand what had been sitting in the dark next to them for all these years. 216, she said. Frontline combat vessels. We have an additional 90 in reserve configuration that can be combat-ready in 72 hours. He was quiet for a long moment. The Conclave's combined active fleet, he said, before the Theron losses, was 430 vessels across 18 member states. I know, she said. You built this. We built this, she said. And for the first time in this conversation, there was something in her voice that was not pure information, something that had a temperature to it. Because we were not going to be helpless twice. We were very clear about that. Very, very clear. He absorbed this. Then he said, quietly, You said you have been watching the Void Chorus for 11 years. Yes. How? She looked at him. She had prepared for this question, had decided in advance how much to give him here. In this first conversation, before the conditions were formally agreed to, and the terms were signed, and the relationship between what humanity was and what the Conclave had assumed it was, had been officially renegotiated. She decided to give him enough to make the point and not one word more. We have had monitoring probes in the deep dark for a long time, she said. Small ones. You didn't find them because we built them to be found only if you knew exactly what to look for. And you didn't know what to look for because you built your sensor systems to detect Conclave standard technology. She let this settle. We are not Conclave standard technology, Ambassador. We haven't been for a long time. He sat with this. She watched him understand what it meant, that while the Conclave had been conducting 17 consecutive scans of a supposedly dead world and finding nothing, humanity had been running its own monitoring network across a significant portion of explored space, quietly, invisibly. For reasons that were now obvious, they had not been hiding from the galaxy. They had been watching it. The Void Chorus, he said. In 11 years of observation. What do you know? More than you, she said. We'll share it when the conditions are agreed. She stood. 6 days, Ambassador. The extraordinary session. Then call me. She closed the channel, sat in the small shielded room for a moment. The hum of the city was everywhere, as it always was. The specific low frequency of a place that had been running continuously for 200 years without pausing. Trains, fabricators, water systems, the power grid that fed the grow lights, that fed the crops, that fed the people who had built all of this and kept it running and kept themselves going in the dark, because going was the only acceptable option. She thought about what came next. Not the battle. She had thought about the battle 10,000 times in drills and simulations and quiet mornings, alone with the tactical data, and she was not afraid of the battle. She was afraid of the thing after the battle, which was the part nobody was running simulations on, the part where humanity came out of the ground, and the galaxy looked at them and had to decide what they were. She knew what they were. She had always known. She just wasn't sure the galaxy was ready for the answer. The 6th day came. Velserith called at 0600 hours. Yara was already at her desk. She had been at her desk since 0400. There was cold tea beside her, which she had not drunk, which was either habit or a form of tribute to a man she was not going to think about right now. The vote passed, he said. He looked like a man who had not slept in 6 days, which was because he was. All 3 conditions, unanimous on the first 2. The third, he paused. 14-4 on the third. It was not easy. I didn't expect it to be, she said. Thank you. He looked at her. Slight surprise. She did not thank people often, and when she did, it cost her something, and he could apparently tell. The fleet, he said. Can you? It's already moving, she said. He blinked. I called you the moment the vote finalized. Yes, she said. I started moving the fleet 2 hours ago. He opened his mouth, closed it. I was confident in the vote, she said. Not arrogant, just accurate. I did not want to lose 2 hours. She pulled up the tactical display on her side of the screen, rotated it so he could see. 216 lights moving through the dark in formation, already through the outer system, already oriented toward the Theron cluster and the thing that was eating worlds there. We enter engagement range in 31 hours. I would recommend the Conclave's remaining vessels hold the perimeter and provide communication relay. I mean no disrespect by that. You mean, he said, slowly, that you don't need them. I mean, she said, with the precise care of someone choosing words the way a surgeon chooses tools, that they would be most useful in a support function, given the engagement data we've collected. She looked at him directly. The Conclave's fleet doctrine is excellent for what it was built for. This is something different. 10. He nodded. He was past the point of arguing with her about military matters. She had given him no reason to trust her instincts, and several hundred data points, and 200 years of patient preparation. And he was old enough to know which of those things actually mattered. Commander Osei, he said, is there anything else you need from us? She thought about it. Genuinely thought about it. For a few seconds. Because he deserved a genuine answer. No, she said. We have everything we need. We've had it for a while. She looked at him one more time, at the 300 years in his face, and the guilt that had been sitting in it since the moment he landed in Undercity Accra, and a child of 8 years had asked him a question he couldn't answer. Ambassador, what we're about to do, we're not doing it for you. Be clear on that. He waited. We're doing it because there are people in the Theron cluster who are going to die if we don't. And they didn't make the decisions their governments made, and they don't deserve to pay for it the way we paid for decisions we didn't make. She said it flat. Clean. Without theater. That's the only reason. Keep that in the file when you write the record of this. He nodded. Something in his face that she didn't look at too long. She closed the channel, stood, walked to the operations room, where her fleet commanders were waiting, where the tactical displays were showing the full picture, the void chorus moving through the Theron cluster like a hand wiping a table clean, and 216 Terran vessels moving to meet it. And she stood at the center of the room, and looked at it all, and felt the thing she always felt, in these moments. Not fear, not excitement, just the clean, grounded certainty of someone who has been preparing for one specific thing for a very long time, and has finally arrived at it. All right, she said. The room looked at her. Let's go to work. Velserith had attended the funerals of civilizations. He had stood in the formal halls of the Conclave Assembly and read the names of species that no longer existed, some lost to war, some to disease, some to the slow grinding erasure of a universe that does not particularly care whether complex life continues. He had read those names in the correct ceremonial register, with the correct ceremonial pauses, and he had felt the appropriate weight of each one. He had thought he understood what loss looked like at a civilizational scale. He had not, he was realizing, understood anything. The observation deck of the Terran flagship Times, Persistence Times, was not a diplomatic space. It had not been built for guests or ceremony, or the comfort of visiting dignitaries. It was a functional room, screens on 3 walls, a central console, the particular cold air of a ship that kept its life support calibrated for function rather than comfort. The view through the forward glass was the Theron cluster, and what was happening in it. Velserith stood at the glass and watched. Fleet Admiral Kwame Asante had not made him comfortable, had not offered him refreshment or positioned him thoughtfully, or done any of the small hospitality gestures that Velserith had experienced in command spaces across 41 worlds. Asante was a large man in his mid-50s. Dark-skinned, with the kind of physical stillness that was not calm, it was control, which was a different thing. He had looked at Velserith when he boarded, nodded once, and returned his attention to his fleet. That was it. That was all the welcome there was. Velserith found, to his own surprise, that he respected this. The Conclave's 3 remaining Theron sector vessels were positioned at the engagement perimeter, as Osei had recommended. Communication relay and observation. Velserith had chosen to observe from the Times, Persistence Times, rather than the Conclave ships, and this decision had generated significant concern from his security staff, who had accompanied him aboard with the stiff, unhappy posture of people who know they cannot do their job properly in this environment, but have no choice but to try. He had told them to stand down. They had not stood down. They had stood in the corner of the observation deck instead, which was the closest thing to standing down that they were capable of. The void chorus was visible on the screens. In the 11 years of Terran monitoring data that Osei's people had shared with the Conclave during the 6 days of negotiation, there had been detailed analysis of what the void chorus looked like up close. Velserith had read every page. He had thought he was prepared for it. He was not prepared for it. It was not a fleet. It was not creatures. Exactly. The best analogy the Terran analysts used was whether it moved the way very bad weather moved, with an internal logic that was not intelligence as any known species understood intelligence, but was also not random. It learned. It adapted. It processed the environment around it and adjusted. What it looked like was a darkness that had decided to have a shape. A movement without clear edges, spreading across the scan field like ink in water, except purposeful, directional, hungry. If hunger was a thing you could ascribe to something that had no mouth, it had consumed 4 worlds in the Theran cluster. The 5th was in its path. The Terran fleet moved to meet it. Velsarith had expected something dramatic in that movement, a grand formation, a visual declaration of force. He had seen the Conclave fleet engage the Void Chorus 4 days ago, and the Conclave fleet had made itself large and visible, and arranged itself in the defensive arc pattern that was standard doctrine for overwhelming force engagements. The Terran fleet did nothing like that. It split, not into 2 groups but into many 17 distinct elements of varying size, each moving on a different vector, spreading across the engagement space in a pattern that made no visual sense for approximately 4 minutes and then, when the full shape became apparent on the tactical display, made complete sense in the way that something complicated always looks like chaos, until the last piece clicks into place. They were not forming a line, they were forming an enclosure. They're trying to contain it, said the Conclave Admiral standing beside Velsarith. Her name was Torveth. She was a career military officer of 50 years' experience, and she had the voice of someone who was maintaining professional composure by force of will. That's you cannot contain the Void Chorus. We established that at Theran Prime. The permeability of its leading edge means any enclosure. They know that, Velsarith said. She looked at him. Watch, he said. The enclosure was not meant to be solid. He had read enough of the Terran tactical doctrine shared openly, because Osei's people had apparently decided that the most effective thing they could do in this engagement was demonstrate that they had nothing to hide, to understand that the containment formation was not designed to stop the Void Chorus from moving. It was designed to shape where it moved, to herd it, into a space where the Terran fleet's specific advantages would be maximized, and its disadvantages minimized. The Void Chorus entered the shape. Velsarith watched it happen in real time on the tactical display, and felt something he had not felt in a long time, the specific sensation of watching someone who genuinely knows what they are doing do it. The first engagement was sharp and fast. Terran ships opened at ranges that the Conclave's tactical protocols did not sanction, closer than doctrine allowed. Closer than safety permitted, close enough that the energy discharge from their weapon systems created feedback interference on their own hull sensors. He had read about this choice in the tactical documentation. The Terran fleet commanders had looked at the engagement data from every previous Void Chorus encounter and made a calculation. The Void Chorus was less effective against targets that were too close to track cleanly. The solution was to get very, very close. The solution was, in the technical sense, insane. It was also working. Their loss rate, Admiral Torveth said, and her professional voice was developing something ragged in it, is already at 12%. Yes, Velsarith said. At that rate, keep watching. 12%, then 14. A Terran frigate took a full chorus node impact on its port side, and the forward third of the ship came apart in a manner that left no ambiguity about the crew in that section. Velsarith watched this on the screen and felt it the way you feel cold air suddenly, all at once, reaching somewhere that had been warm. The remaining 2/3 of the frigate kept moving, firing, still, in formation. He watched a Terran destroyer, a mid-sized vessel, the kind of ship that the Conclave would classify as significant but not irreplaceable, take damage to its primary drive that left it moving on partial thrust, listing to one side, its hull integrity warnings visible on the feed as a cascade of red across the damage schematic. The correct move, by every doctrine he had ever studied, was withdrawal and salvage. The ship was compromised. Continuing to fight in that condition was an unacceptable risk to crew. The destroyer did not withdraw. It accelerated. Velsarith watched it happen in the 3 seconds before he understood what was happening. And then he understood. And then it happened. And the Void Chorus mass node, that had been the focal point of that engagement sector, came apart in an energy release that washed across the scan feed, in white. The destroyer was gone. He stood at the glass for a moment without speaking. "They're not retreating," Admiral Torveth said. Her composure was showing the cracks now, openly. "Their losses are at 22%, and they are not retreating. Their own doctrine, I read, their tactical documentation. Their own withdrawal threshold is, their withdrawal threshold exists," Velserith said, "for an enemy that responds to withdrawal the way conventional enemies do." He kept his eyes on the screens. "The Void Chorus does not stop because you leave. It continues to the next target. The Terran fleet is not fighting to preserve its assets." He paused. "It is fighting to end the engagement. Those are not the same objective." Torveth was quiet for a moment. "That distinction costs them ships." "Yes. That distinction costs them people." "Yes." She had nothing to say to that. He did not have anything either. The silence between them was not comfortable. It was the silence of two people from the same institutional background looking at something that came from outside that background and not having the right words for it yet. The Void Chorus shifted. It was the first major adaptation it had shown in the engagement, a lateral movement, a spreading of its leading density across a wider front, which was a pattern that Velserith had seen in the Theron Prime battle footage. When the Conclave fleet had done that, the Void Chorus spread and thinned and became impossible to engage concentratedly, and the fleet had been forced to scatter, and the engagement had collapsed into a series of isolated skirmishes that the Chorus won, one by one. He watched the Terran fleet's response, and his hand, which had been resting on the rail in front of him, tightened, without his deciding to tighten it. They had already moved, not in response to the lateral shift. Before it, 11 separate fleet elements repositioning in the 30 seconds before the Chorus made its move, cutting off the vectors the spread would have needed to be effective, collapsing the engagement space back into a concentrated zone before the Chorus had finished executing its own maneuver. They had anticipated it, Admiral Torveth said, slowly. "That's not reaction time, they anticipated that." "Yes." "How?" It was not really a question. The answer was obvious to both of them. The Terran fleet had 11 years of Void Chorus movement data. They had watched every engagement, every adaptation, every tactical shift the Chorus had used, across 14 consumed worlds. They had cataloged it all and built models and run simulations and prepared responses for every pattern the data showed. They knew this enemy. Not from the outside, the way the Conclave knew it, from crisis reports and emergency responses and the desperate scramble of a military that had been caught unprepared. They knew it from years of quiet, dedicated study while nobody was watching, from inside a sealed planet, from the dark. Admiral Asante's voice came across the open channel. He was directing fleet elements across several simultaneous threads of communication with the calm of a man watering a garden, purposeful, measured, each movement placed. He had not looked at the observation deck once since the engagement began. A query came through from the Conclave's communication relay vessel, asking about the repositioning, the anticipation, how the fleet had known to move before the Void Chorus committed to its lateral shift. Asante reached over to the open channel without turning from his tactical display. He answered the query in the same tone he used for everything, not unkind, not arrogant, simply factual. "That's Pattern 7 from the Conclave's Contact War Playbook. Revised edition. We've been running simulations against it since I was 12. The relay channel was quiet for a long moment. Velserith heard Torveth make a sound beside him. Not a word, just a sound. The sound of a thing settling that had been incorrectly balanced. The Conclave's Contact War Playbook. The tactical doctrine humanity had studied from the wreckage of what had been done to them. Taken apart, understood at a fundamental level, drilled into children in the schools of Undercity Accra. Not because the Conclave was the enemy anymore, but because understanding the Conclave's doctrine was the first step to building something that went past it, and the Void Chorus had learned its movement patterns from the 14 civilizations it had consumed, most of them Conclave members, all of them fighting with Conclave-adjacent doctrine. So when the Void Chorus used a Conclave pattern lateral shift, the Terran fleet saw a Conclave lateral shift, and responded before it fully formed. 47 years of simulations running against patterns that the Void Chorus itself had absorbed from previous engagements and now used as its own. Pattern recognition going 4 levels deep. 200 years of fury turned into 47 years of homework. Velserith thought about the child in the landing bay. "Are you here to apologize?" He thought about the schools with their flower boxes 400 meters underground. He thought about Commander Osei at 17, deciding what her grandmother's tooth meant, deciding what it was for. He thought about all the things that got built in the dark when someone left you there long enough. The engagement broke at hour 19. Not because the void chorus was destroyed, it was not. It was not the kind of thing that destroyed cleanly. But at hour 19, something changed in its movement. A hesitation, a pulling back of density from the leading edge, a behavioral shift that the Terran Fleet's analysts Vel Sereth could hear them in the background of the command channel, voices fast and precise identified in real time as a recalibration response. The void chorus was processing the engagement. It had run its known patterns, all of them, one after another, across 19 hours, and every one had been anticipated. Every adaptation had been met. It had consumed civilizations by being a thing that learned faster than anything it encountered. It had not encountered anything like this before. It pulled back, not a rout, not a defeat, a withdrawal into deep space, a regrouping, a behavior that the Terran analysts were already categorizing and debating the implications of on open channel. Vel Sereth listened to them debate it with the speed and precision of people who had been thinking about this exact question for years and were now working with real data instead of models. The fifth world in the Theron cluster was still there. Not saved, exactly. The void chorus had not finished with it, but it was still there, which was more than the previous four could claim. The Terran fleet held its position, did not pursue. Fleet Admiral Asante ordered a full damage assessment and recovery operation with the same business-like calm he had used for everything else, and the fleet began the organized work of accounting for itself. Vel Sereth did the accounting too, in his own way. Terran losses, 31 vessels. Not destroyed, some of them, the ones that had taken catastrophic hits. The others were damaged at various levels of severity. Crews alive, ships recoverable, 31 out of 216, 14%. In any conclave engagement doctrine, 14% was an acceptable loss rate for an engagement of this scale and intensity. He stood at the glass and looked at the recovery operation beginning in the space ahead of him, ships moving to assist damaged vessels, emergency teams deploying, the organized and practiced efficiency of a force that had prepared for this too, and he did not feel anything as clean as relief. What he felt was harder to name. He thought about the conclave's emergency session 6 days ago, the 14-4 vote. 4 people who had looked at humanity's 3 conditions and found one of them too much to give. He had argued for 6 hours in that session. He had not been eloquent. He had simply been, for the first time in his career, unable to be anything except honest. He had told the assembly what he had seen underground. The parks, the schools, the child, with her question. He had told them, as plainly as he knew how, that what was sitting in the Sol system was not what the quarantine file described, and that when humanity came out of the ground, and they would come out, the only question was, what shape the coming out took. The conclave had one opportunity to be on the right side of that moment. 1. 14-4. He was grateful for the 14. He was not surprised by the 4. He had been on councils long enough to understand that some people were constitutionally incapable of seeing the shape of a moment until after it had passed. Admiral Torveth was standing beside him still. She had been quiet for a long time. She looked at the screens the way people look at things that have changed the internal architecture of something they thought was settled. She said finally, "They held." "Yes," he said. 14% losses, 19 hours. "They held." "Yes." She was quiet again. Then, "Our fleet, at Theron Prime, 30% losses, and we withdrew." The doctrine said. The doctrine, Vel Sereth said, was built for an enemy that stops. She looked at him. "The void chorus does not stop," he said. Humanity understood that before they ever engaged it. They built a doctrine for an enemy that does not stop, which required them to also become something that does not stop. He looked at the screens. At the 31, damaged and destroyed ships. At the 4th world still sitting in the Theron system. Still there. The cost of becoming that is what you saw in those 19 hours. She had nothing to say to this. He didn't need her to. He stayed on the observation deck for a long time after that, watching the recovery operation, until the Theron cluster's star moved past the edge of the forward glass, and the screens showed only the dark and the fleet working quietly in it. Then he went to write his report. He wrote it carefully. He wrote it in the specific way that he had learned in 300 years of service. Was the only way that reports of this nature served any purpose, not as a confirmation of what the conclave already believed, but as an honest account of what had actually happened. He wrote about the 19 hours. He wrote about Pattern 7. He wrote about the destroyer that had accelerated instead of withdrawing, and what that meant about the people who had crewed it, and the civilization that had raised them. He wrote about the 14%, and what 14% looked like from the observation deck of the ship that was carrying it. He wrote one final line that he had not planned when he sat down. They did not fight like they had something to prove. They fought like they had something to finish. He sent the report. Then he sat in the small diplomatic cabin they had given him, and he thought about a child of 8 years with a question he still had not answered. He thought about it for a long time. Outside, in the dark, the Terran fleet held the line around a world that was still there. Still there is less than, thinking, is greater than. The Conclave's Grand Assembly Hall was the kind of room that had been designed to make individuals feel small. Yara had read about it. Photographs and architectural schematics had been in the Terran intelligence files for decades, sourced from intercepted Conclave communications, from study of public broadcasts, from the particular obsessive thoroughness of people who had spent 200 years making sure they knew everything about the organization that had left them to die. The hall seated 4,000. The ceiling was 60 meters above the floor. The central speaking platform was elevated and ringed with light that hit the speaker from above, which had the twin effect of making them visible to everyone and making them look, subtly, like they were being judged by something larger than themselves. Standing in it was different from reading about it. It was a very large room. She gave it that. She had arrived without an escort fleet. 1 shuttle, 3 aides, and her own 2 feet walking across the landing platform, in the kind of clothes that made a statement, by not making one dark, plain, practical. The same things she wore on working days in Undercity Accra. No ceremonial dress, no medals, though she had several. No Terran seal on her collar, though one had been offered. The tooth on its cord, at her throat, under the fabric. That was all. The Conclave's protocol office had sent 3 separate messages in the week before this session, each one politely requesting information about the Terran delegation's size and ceremonial requirements. She had replied to all 3 with the same answer. 1 person, no requirements. The protocol office had not known what to do with this and had, eventually, done nothing, which was fine. The session had been called as a formal recognition ceremony. That was what the agenda said. The language in the official documentation used phrases like historic reconciliation and renewed partnership, and the beginning of a new chapter in galactic relations, all of which were technically accurate in the way that describing a tidal wave as significant water movement was technically accurate. The hall was full. Every member state delegation present, every seat taken, the press enclosures packed, the observation galleries above holding what looked like every diplomat, analyst, and political figure in range who had been able to arrange credentials in the 3 weeks since the Theran engagement. 4,000 people who had all, in one way or another, spent the last month rearranging their understanding of what the galaxy contained. They watched her walk across the floor to the central platform. She was aware of being watched in the way that a person is aware of weather, not self-consciously, just as a fact of the environment. She did not perform for it, did not slow down or speed up or look around at the galleries. She walked at the pace she always walked, which was the pace of someone going somewhere specific for a reason. The Conclave's presiding speaker met her at the platform steps. His name was Archon Seluvan, and he was the most senior active official in the Conclave's governance structure, a distinction he had held for 30 years and wore the way very old furniture wears polish, smoothly and completely, so that you almost couldn't see the wood underneath anymore. He was gracious. He was warm. He extended the formal greeting gesture of the host civilization, and she returned it correctly, because she had learned it at age 6 in a school 400 meters underground. He led her to the platform. The address began. It was a good speech. She would give it that. Seluvan had spent 30 years at the top of Conclave governance, and he had not gotten there by being a poor communicator. The speech was structured beautifully. It moved from acknowledgement to context to resolution in a clean arc, and the language was careful and warm, and hit the emotional registers it was aiming for with the accuracy of long practice. She counted 11 uses of the passive voice in 4 minutes. Regrettable circumstances arose. Not, we made decisions. Circumstances arose, as though on their own, from the floor, without any agency attached to them. Contact protocols were misapplied. Not, we weaponized first contact with a pre-spaceflight civilization. Protocols were misapplied, the way a tool is misapplied, as though the hand holding the tool was not there. Outcomes were not intended. Not, we quarantined a species we had bombed and left them to die in the dark for 200 years, and checked on them 17 times and every time confirmed they were dead and moved on. Outcomes were not intended, floating free of cause and consequence, and the specific people who had sat in specific rooms and made specific choices. She sat through it, completely still, her hands in her lap, the expression of someone listening to weather. The speech turned, in its final section, to the future, to what the conclave was prepared to offer, to the remarkable partnership that lay ahead, full membership in the Galactic Conclave, with all rights and responsibilities thereto, a permanent seat on the Security Council, reparations, substantial and immediate, toward the restoration of Earth's surface, co-development agreements for technology exchange, a joint commission to oversee the dismantling of the Sol quarantine infrastructure. It was, by any measure, a significant offer. The kind of offer that would have been extraordinary at any point in the last 2 centuries. The kind of offer that, if she had been her grandmother, would have seemed like the answer to a prayer. She was not her grandmother. Her grandmother had survived 11 years on a dying surface teaching children things they would need. Her grandmother had given her daughter a tooth from her own mouth and said, "Give this to your daughter. Let her decide what it means." Yara had decided at 17. Seluvan finished. The hall was very quiet. The silence of 4,000 people, all holding the same breath. She stood. She did not approach the speaking position immediately. She stood at her seat for a moment, looking at the room, looking at the delegations, the galleries, the 60-meter ceiling, with its particular light. She had grown up under lower ceilings than this one. She had grown up in rooms that were excellent at what they did, and had never once been designed to make anyone feel small. She walked to the speaking position. She looked at the room. She had prepared remarks. 12 pages, written over 3 weeks, reviewed by the council. Precise and comprehensive and correct in every particular. They addressed the membership offer, the reparations structure, the technology co-development framework, the quarantine dismantling timeline. They were good remarks. They said everything that needed to be said clearly and completely. She did not use them. She looked at the hall. At 4,000 people who had come here expecting a ceremony and were going to get something different. She said, "We don't want a seat at your table, we built one." The silence was total. She reached into her jacket and produced a data chip, small, flat. The standard Terran format that the Conclave systems could read without an adapter. Because of course they could, because Terran engineers had made sure of that a long time ago. She set it on the surface of the speaking platform. "That's our terms," she said. "You have 30 days. She stepped back from the speaking position. She walked across the platform and down the steps and across the floor of the hall in the same silence that she had walked into it with, and 4,000 people watched her go, and nobody said anything until she was through the main doors and the doors had closed behind her, and then the hall erupted in exactly the noise she had expected it to erupt in, which was why she had already left. Her aide Kofi was waiting in the corridor with her jacket and a look of intense personal satisfaction that he was not quite hiding. "Well," he said. "Don't," she said. "I wasn't going to say anything. You were going to say something." He handed her the jacket. "The shuttle is ready." She put the jacket on, touched the tooth through the fabric, started walking. Behind the closed doors, the hall was still going. She could hear it even here, the specific sound of a very large room full of very important people, all trying to talk at once. It would take them a while to sort out what had just happened and what to do about it, and whether the chip's contents were acceptable, and what the leverage was, and where the negotiating room existed. They had 30 days. They would use 28 of them arguing and 2 of them agreeing, because that was how institutions worked. And she had accounted for this, and the terms on the chip were exactly what she had said they were in the communications room 3 weeks ago. The 2 non-negotiable things, and the rest, which was negotiable. She had been precise about which was which. She always was. The shuttle lifted 6 minutes later. She sat in the forward seat and looked down through the port at the conclave's capital world shrinking below her. All glass and height, and 2,000 years of institutional architecture, and she felt something that she had not expected to feel, which was tired, not physically, the other kind, the kind that was not really tiredness but was the particular feeling of a weight you have carried so long that its absence feels strange. It was not gone. She knew that. The work was not done. It would not be done in her lifetime, possibly. There were things on the chip that would take decades to implement, and generations to measure. The Void Chorus was still out there, recalibrating, which meant the TCA's fleet was going to be doing this again, and the galaxy needed to figure out what that relationship looked like in the long term. The surface of Earth needed 10 years of remediation before it could sustain agricultural use, and another 20 before the first permanent surface structures were safe to inhabit. There was a very large amount of work still to do. She looked out the port at the stars. She thought about her grandmother, which she did not normally allow herself to do during working hours. She thought about 11 years on a dying surface, about teeth on cords, about what it meant that the girl who had been handed that tooth was now sitting in a shuttle, leaving the conclave's capital world after setting a data chip on their speaking platform and telling 4,000 of the most powerful people in the galaxy that they had 30 days. What it meant was very simple. It meant the tooth had been for something all along. She fell asleep in the shuttle, which she had not done in 3 weeks of working days and nights, and she slept without dreams, and Kofi covered her with his own jacket and did not wake her for 7 hours, and when she woke up they were almost home. 6 months later, on a morning in what would have been late spring if the surface had been habitable, the first reclamation teams went up, not military. The military had done its part. These were engineers and agricultural specialists and soil scientists and remediation crews with equipment that had been designed specifically for this, designed underground, over many years, by people who had always intended to use it, exactly here, exactly for this. The reclamation started in what had been the Accra metropolitan region. It was not arbitrary. The largest of the underground cities was directly below. The people who had built it underground had built it below the place they came from, and when it was time to go back, they went back to the same ground. The radiation scrubbing drones went first. They swept in low passes across the surface for 4 days, methodical, overlapping their coverage the way you scrub a floor not once but twice, not twice but 3 times, until the instruments said the numbers had moved enough to permit the next stage. Then the soil teams, then the planting crews, who brought seeds that had been preserved underground for 2 centuries, not in storage, not in cold vault stasis, but actively maintained, grown in rotation. Each generation of seeds descended from seeds that had been carried underground in the first year and kept going ever since. 200-year-old seedlines. Every harvest replanted. Nothing lost. Yara stood on a ridge above the Accra Basin on the 4th day of planting operations and looked at it for the first time. She had seen photographs. She had seen the geological surveys and the remediation progress reports and the drone footage from every angle. She had processed the data of this place for years, its radiation index, its soil composition, its topography, its historical records. She had known it in the way that you can know a place entirely without knowing it. This was different. The sky was bigger than she had expected. That was the thing nobody had told her, and she had not been able to prepare for. That the sky was not a ceiling, but an absence, a space that did not end, blue-gray with high cloud and the particular pale quality of a world still healing. And it went up and did not stop. She had lived her whole life under ceilings. Good ones. Ceilings she had never resented because they were necessary and because what was under them was worth protecting. But they were ceilings. This was not a ceiling. She stood in the wind, actual wind, which moved against her face with the careless abundance of something that had no idea it was extraordinary, and looked at the teams below her in the basin, working in organized lines through the freshly turned soil. Thousands of people. The first humans to work surface soil in 200 years, doing it with the calm efficiency of people who had been preparing for this specific task long enough that it felt like coming home rather than arriving somewhere new. Because it was. A group of children moved through the perimeter near the base of the ridge. A school group. She could see the teachers at the edges. keeping the loose boundaries that kept children somewhere in the vicinity of where they were supposed to be, without crushing the essential disorder of a pack of young people experiencing something for the first time. The children were in the soil up to their elbows within 3 minutes of arrival, which was predictable and correct, and exactly what soil was for. One girl, maybe 8 or 9, was crouched at the edge of a freshly turned bed with her hands pressed flat to the ground, not digging, not planting, just pressing her hands down into the dark earth with the focused stillness of someone paying very close attention to something important. She lifted her hands and looked at them, looked at the earth on her palms, turned them over, looked at the sky. Yara watched this from the ridge and felt the thing she felt come up in her chest and move through her throat and sit behind her eyes, and she let it, because there was no one watching her from up here and because some things deserved to be felt completely when they arrived. She had spent her whole life carrying things toward this. The tooth. Her grandmother's hands. The 11 years on the surface and the thing that was built from them underground and the 200 years of patience that were not really patience but purpose. Slow burning, generation to generation, passed down in schools and dinner tables and the specific way people in Undercity Accra touched each other's shoulders when they passed in corridors, which was a thing her grandmother had apparently done too, which Yara had not known was a habit she had inherited until someone pointed it out when she was 30. 200 years of things carried forward. Coming, finally, to this, a girl's hands in the first clean soil. She reached up and held the tooth through her jacket, held it for a moment, felt its specific shape, the one she had memorized so long ago she couldn't remember memorizing it. Then she let it go. She looked at the basin below, at the teams working in their organized lines through the dark earth, at the sky that did not end, at the children in the soil, at the ridge under her feet, which was the surface of a planet that had been declared dead and had declined to comply. The conclave had 30 days on the chip's terms and they were going to use 28 of them arguing, and then the work of building whatever came next would begin, which was going to be complicated and long and full of the specific friction of new things, finding their shape. There were 4,000 things to negotiate and 17 categories of disagreement, and the Void Chorus was still somewhere in the dark, doing the slow math of its recalibration, and her fleet needed resupply, and the remediation schedule had already hit its first delay in Sector 3, and the Council had requested a briefing on the technology exchange framework that she needed to prepare by end of next week. There was a very large amount of work still to do. She stood in the wind on the ridge above the Accra Basin and looked at the girl in the soil and the sky that didn't stop, and she breathed in the particular smell of the surface mineral, cold-edged, the distant green of things beginning, and she took exactly as long as she needed. Then she turned back down the ridge toward the base camp. Back to work. The ground did not shake under her feet. It never needed to. The trembling had always been in the ones who looked at this world from the safety of deep space and decided they knew what it was. The ones who had assumed that silence was the same as death, that 200 years underground was the same as gone, that a people written off stayed written off. The ground was solid under her feet, had always been solid. 400 meters below it, a city hummed. 6 months from now, the first surface structure would break ground above that city, and the sky and the underground would connect, and the long separation of those two things would be over. The girl in the soil was still looking at her hands, still looking at the sky. Yara walked down the ridge and got back to work, and above her, for the first time in 200 years, the sky of Earth was full of nothing threatening at all. Just light, just wind, just a world deciding, quietly and finally, what came next.